Welcome to Raaonline. Today I'm going to talk to you about neonatal hypoglycemia. So the objectives of this talk would be to see the normal physiology of glucose homeostasis, what is the definition of hypoglycemia, the etiology of hypoglycemia, what will be the symptoms, lab diagnosis, differential diagnosis and management. Okay, so the normal physiology of glucose homeostasis, this is in regard to fetuses and newborn babies. Glucose normally provides 60 to 70% of the fetal energy, and the fetal glucose is mainly derived by maternal transplacental diffusion. Fetal glucose levels is usually maintained at 2/3 of maternal levels. So, if the maternal demands of glucose also increases because of increased fetal demand, maternal hepatic glucose production increases by 16 to 30% in gestation to supply fetus with energy. So what happens when the baby is born? The umbilical cord is severed. Then the newborn immediately responds by glycogenolysis of hepatic stores. So what happens initially when the baby is in the fetus itself? Glucose is utilized and then glucose is converted with the help of insulin into glycogen, which is stored in the fetal liver. So when the baby is born, that glycogen is again converted into glucose, which is called as glycogenolysis, and the hepatic stores are utilized for glucose. Gluconeogenesis is also another way through which the newborn baby immediately after birth gets its glucose supply. So gluconeogenesis is by converting other substrates into glucose, not using the carbohydrate moiety, using more of amino acids which are metabolized to give glucose, which is called as gluconeogenesis. Okay. Then utilizing exogenous nutrients. So how does the baby get the exogenous nutrients? To mother's breast milk. So as the mother starts feeding the baby, then the baby starts getting more of the glucose supply. So this was all done as a study in a GLOW trial where they saw normal newborns and newborns at slightly higher risk, no significant congenital disorders. This trial was done in 2020 and it showed that initially, though the baby tries to get its glucose supplies by glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, in the first 1 to 2 hours, there can be a rapid decline in blood glucose levels, and subsequently, the glucose increases to the normal range of about 65 to 70. So this transient hypoglycemia for very well babies can last maybe 1 day, maximum 2 days, and for high-risk babies are like preterm babies, IUGR babies, such babies the hypoglycemia can last even up to 4 days. So what is the definition of hypoglycemia? Okay. So a blood glucose level of less than 40 milligram per deciliter and a plasma glucose level of less than 45 milligram per deciliter is considered to be hypoglycemia. So causes of hypoglycemia. So this can be because of low glycogen reserves. So low glycogen reserves is because as the baby is normally in the fetus, extra glucose taken by the baby is stored in the liver. So in extreme preterm babies or IUGR, the storage of glucose as glycogen could be lesser. So because of that, as the baby is born, the reserves are less to be converted to glucose immediately and they can get hypoglycemia. Energy demands increasing when there's a sudden stress for the baby. Sudden stress like as in sepsis, or there is asphyxia or hypothermia. Here there is increased utilization of glucose to maintain the situation at that point by the baby. So because of this increased energy demand, and already since the baby has to use the reserves that it has had from intrauterine, there can be hypoglycemia. Persistent hypoglycemia can be because of certain congenital disorders like congenital endocrine disorders, where it can be like hypopituitarism, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or it can be because of congenital hyperinsulinemia. It can also be because of acquired hyperinsulinemia as seen in gestational diabetes mellitus, hypopituitarism, inborn errors of metabolism, where there is a defect in conversion of alternate pathways into glucose, and hence babies are not able to generate adequate glucose when they are not getting sufficient glucose through external source like feeding. So what we saw initially now was low causes of hypoglycemia. Now what we are going to see is a major cause of hypoglycemia, which is hyperinsulinemia. So the etiology of hyperinsulinemia, the commonest that we usually see is gestational diabetes and secondary to other conditions. Okay, very rarely we see something like congenital hyperinsulinemia. So hyperinsulinemia in gestational diabetes. So in gestational diabetes, let's start from intrauterine. When the baby is inside, the mother is having already increased glucose in her blood. So as the mother is having increased glucose in mom, so what happens? Baby gets increased glucose. So because baby gets increased glucose, excess glucose is converted to glycogen. Okay, so excess glucose is converted into glycogen with the help of, this is done with the help of insulin. So since there is already excess glucose, what happens is the insulin in the fetus also increases. Okay, so now when the baby is born, after the birth, now the baby is getting less supply. Less supply of glucose. So what does it have to do? It now has to convert the liver stores. The liver stores are converted, have to be converted into glucose. So what is the liver stores? It is glycogen. Okay, so but what is happening is, now there is already increased insulin, but there is the liver stores glycogen has to be converted into glucose. But what is happening? There is already increased insulin here. So because of the increased insulin, this inhibits conversion of the liver stores of glycogen into glucose. So what will happen is the baby will have hypoglycemia.